Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptation. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. This will be part 2 of my Heated Rivalry Q&A. I had reached out to people who follow along with my content on TikTok and Instagram, asking for any questions they wanted me to do a deep dive on or talk about on here. And I had so many that I had to break it up into 2 parts. So I already published part 1. Be sure to go back and listen to that. And this is going to dive into some of the other topics that these questions fell under, including character psychology, some of the more hockey relevant questions I got, side characters, supporting characters, visuals for season 2, and also some personal questions about my process and how I am analyzing the show. Before we get started, just a quick note that this episode includes discussion of disordered eating. It's not graphic, but if that's something you're sensitive to, feel free to skip. I just want to flag that so you can have a heads up on that. And we will be discussing spoilers for The Long Game if you're looking to avoid those. So without further ado, here's part 2 of our Heated Rivalry Q&A. This question is, I'm curious about Ilia's jealousy. He has a double standard in that it's okay for him to have hookups, but is jealous when Shane has actual relationships. Have you addressed this already? Even in The Long Game, Ilia still feels a little uncomfortable with the rose factor. So this might be a long response. I think this presents as a double standard on the surface, but it's actually more of a window into Ilia's deeper insecurities and fears that stem from his childhood wounds and traumas. And it's important to keep in mind that Shane is also jealous of Svetlana and gets upset when Ilia suggests marrying her, even if strictly for a passport. So they both experience jealousy, and jealousy is inherently an emotion that doesn't always make logical sense sometimes. But Ilia has a fear of being unlovable and also of not being good enough for Shane or chosen by him. So I think to answer this, you have to first determine whether or not the significance attached to sex and hookups is the same for Shane versus Ilia, and it's not. Because for Ilia, sex has an entirely different meaning to him than it does for Shane, at least when they first meet. And by the time Ilia is in love with Shane, sex with women is meaningless compared to his relationship with Shane. It takes Ilia being put in Shane's position, meaning watching him be with other people, for him to start to grow and have that character development. But it all stems from the fact that Ilia has been sleeping with people since he was 14, and that was in an attempt to cope with his own trauma. In The Long Game, Ilia is speaking with his therapist about this and says that initially hockey was Ilia's escape after his mother died because it got him away from home and let him get out some of his anger. But then he also started to use sex as a way to escape his trauma as well because it kept his mind and body busy. At first, it was girls only, and then boys too, not as many, but some. And his therapist points out that that would have been very risky for him to be doing that in Russia. And Ilia says that is part of what he liked about it, the danger. And in Heated Rivalry, he reflects that he loved being with people he knew he shouldn't be with. He couldn't resist a bad idea. He also tells his therapist that his desire to be with men didn't scare him. And in part, that's because he simply saw it as another opportunity for more sex. And he felt that being attracted to men had made him evolve. Whenever Ilia reflects back on his experiences before Shane, they are very impersonal and described like a means to an end. He would get an endorphin rush and feel relaxed after. He enjoyed meeting new people, talking to them, charming them. And when he was in Boston, he went out and hooked up with people all the time, went to clubs, went to parties. But in The Long Game, he says he doesn't miss sleeping around because now he only wants Shane and is very happy to be in a monogamous relationship with him. But that sparks a memory where Ilia recalls that he and Shane had talked about being with other people a couple years before the moment in the book that he's talking to his therapist. He had told Shane, as casually as he could, that if Shane wanted to have sex with other men while they were apart, since that was going to be most of the time with their schedules, that Shane could. And Ilia figured that made sense because Shane had just figured out his sexuality at the same time that he admitted he was in love with Ilia. So to Ilia, if Shane wanted to explore sex beyond what Ilia could give him, he had tried to convince himself that it didn't matter. So long as Shane's heart belonged to him, he would be able to convince himself that he was okay with that. But deep down, he knew that was a lie. And Shane takes this suggestion very poorly because he thought it might have been Ilia's way of letting him know that he had been cheating or wanted to hook up with other people. But then Ilia tells Shane he doesn't believe in cheating because he didn't own Shane. And that further upset Shane to the point where they didn't talk for 4 days. Then when Shane finally confronts him about it, he asks Ilia if he really wouldn't mind if Shane slept with someone else. And Ilia, in a way that he self-sacrifices all the time, says, of course not, if that's what you would want. But then Shane tells him he's a moron because that isn't what he wants. And it's only then when Ilia is flooded with relief because the thought of someone else touching Shane made him feel sick. And he had been worried that Shane was calling him from a hotel room in Philly because he was about to hook up with someone else or had already hooked up with someone else. So this is an example of Ilia's initial feelings around sex and what it means to him versus Shane and how those feelings evolve once he's in love. He had never been in love before, so emotions had never entered into it until Shane. And this memory that he's telling his therapist is where we can see that Ilia would be upset over anyone being with Shane and not just Rose. But Rose is a really pivotal part of the story because she remains in Shane's life after they sleep together. Shane had hooked up with other men, and Ilia and Shane speak of it in the books, but Rose and Shane are friends. So for Ilia, Rose is the only other person that Shane dated, fit with, and then he liked her enough to still be friends after they dated, which means it was more than just sex for him. And she represented an alternative life that Shane could have had, where it would have been easier and picture perfect compared to the more complicated relationship that Ilia and Shane have been hiding within. Ilia brings up Rose often in the book, but in My Dinner with Hayden, the bonus scene, Ilia admits that he actually likes her a lot. He puts a movie on the TV with her in it, calls her beautiful, and then jokingly says, "You could have had it all." And this line is another window into his feelings and why Rose has always felt like somewhat of a threat to him. And it's because at one point when Rose and Shane got together, Ilia had to face that very real fear that Shane could be with someone else who he could love freely and easily and who he was great with and who Shane got along very well with. And at that point when Rose and Shane get together, Ilia does not know that Shane is gay because Shane still does not know that himself. Not fully until episode 5. So for Ilia, watching Shane being with Rose or any other woman is still considered a very real option for him. Not to mention, Ilia was already in a very fragile state because of how the tuna melt scene went and Shane leaving. So he would have been upset no matter who it was and who came into the picture next. But when Shane and Rose first get together, Ilia is experiencing jealousy for the first time ever. He acknowledges that he should be happy for Shane. Why shouldn't Shane be with a beautiful woman when Ilia was so often himself? But because Ilia is so observant and studies Shane, he knows that this is not normal behavior for him. It strays outside the boundaries of what Ilia has learned and expected of Shane. So for Shane to behave this way doubly knocks him on his ass and makes him question if Shane might be in love, which sends him spiraling so much that he purposely hooks up with a girl who looks like Shane with dark hair and freckles to cope. He's being immature here because he's still young. He doesn't know how to deal with his frustration and jealousy, which are both foreign feelings to him. And so he behaves in a retaliatory way, trying to pretend that he's unbothered. And the club scene is the first time they see each other outside of the hockey setting. And they're both so hurt by seeing each other with other people. Subconsciously, it's because they know they can't behave this way in public with each other like they'd want to. And Ilia reflects on that in the hotel room after, about how he would have wanted to dance with Shane and couldn't, or how good he looked. And I think that a huge part of Ilia's jealousy of Rose is that Shane is able to behave that way with her and not with Ilia. And the appearance of Rose forces Ilia to start to recognize that the feelings inside of him and the thoughts he has about Shane are becoming too hard and painful to ignore. He had been with many women who were fun and gorgeous, but he didn't think about them after, and he didn't long for them in the same way that he did with Shane. That's something he thinks of in the book as well. At one point, he even thinks to himself that Shane is the only person to set him on fire, and he knows that being with Shane is not a realistic option, but he's so desperate for things to continue. And that's reinforced in the All-Star game in Tampa when Ilia is trying to figure out if Shane and Rose are together, and he worries that Shane will tell him, I'm seeing someone, I'm engaged, I don't need you anymore. Ilia is not jealous of Rose. He is scared of Rose having Shane and Ilia not being able to have him anymore in any capacity. Keep in mind that Shane is also jealous of Svetlana. So again, their jealousy is aligned there. In the finale, when Rose texts and Ilia gets jealous and says, yeah, not too gay to fuck Rose Landry, to me that actually means you got to be her boyfriend in public and people loved you for it, and I'm upset that I don't have that with you. So Rose gets part of Shane that Ilia doesn't have access to yet and feels like he never will at that point in the storyline. So Rose triggers that within him. He's also jealous of a lot of things in the long game, and that doesn't improve until they both commit to communicating better and working through their hang-ups. So it's very much a part of his character growth and development that as he ages and continues to learn what it means to be a partner to someone, how to deal with his depression and his own mental health, and also learns how to ask for what he needs and how he wants to be loved, that jealousy starts to go away. And Shane is a big part of that because as they start to communicate better, he heals that really deep-seated insecurity and fear from his childhood that Ilia is unlovable and not good enough for Shane to be chosen by him. And so it's a very full circle moment that takes them both a long time to get to that resolution. But I don't think that initially when this is happening in the story, it's a double standard so much as it is an irrational feeling that Ilia doesn't have the tools yet to cope with and deal with properly. This question is, how does hockey, or what little we see, play a role in their relationship, good and bad? I would say that hockey is the only way this book is what it is, and this show is what it is, in my opinion. It's been so interesting for me to see how people that don't have the added context of the sport and its culture are consuming it, because it almost feels like there's this additional layer to everything we see on screen that only hockey adjacent people would understand fully or even see and feel. I think that is in large part because this show was Canadian made and Canadian funded, and it was initially only going to air in Canada. So the writing may leave out a lot of the exposition because it would have assumed its audience, and that audience would know the parameters of hockey and the implications of its culture on these two characters a lot better than a global community that's very unfamiliar with it. But to me, the role it plays in their relationship is harder to quantify because hockey is essentially who they are and what they were raised and shaped within. And you can't simply separate Ilia or Shane from hockey because it is deeply a part of them. And I say that as someone who played from the time I could walk and was raised in a hockey family. And I'm a female hockey player in America who only played through college, not a male phenom hockey player who is the face of an original six team in the NHL and represents my country on an Olympic and national team roster. So even my own experience has its own limits on what I can assume this would feel like for them. I can only project so much of what I know and understand onto them, but what I can say is that hockey culture permeates into every facet of my life in one way or another, and I think that's true for every hockey player. Nearly every pillar in my life can be traced back to or connected to hockey in some way. So I'd say on a more surface level, the hockey in this series and the book series is the arena, pun intended, that they operate within. They meet at a rink, they do a commercial in a rink, they talk in a locker room, they talk in a hotel gym, they hook up in hotels on the road and at awards and at all-star events. They only hook up when their teams play each other, when they're at the same hockey events. Shane and Ilia as a pairing don't exist outside of hockey-related spaces or events for a very long time. Their worlds and lives are scheduled for them. They are focused on improving their performance and sport, and largely don't think about or do things outside of that. It also means that they are two people who can fully understand the unique experience they both share, because even their own teammates would not fully understand the pressures that Shane and Ilia specifically are under due to their talent levels and captaincies and the very high expectations thrust upon them from the time they were very young. I think the best way to summarize that is a passage in Heated Rivalry, the book, where after Shane and Ilia play each other in international tournament, they lock eyes and Shane squeezes Ilia's fingers when they're going through the handshake line. And Ilia thinks to himself, I know, we were supposed to stand alone at the top, but we will always be there together. We will keep climbing until no one can reach us, but it will always be together. And I think that really succinctly explains that these two guys are the only people that understand the position that they're in. On a deeper level, both of them are competitors and professional athletes, and up until the point in which they meet, they were the best player on every single team they had ever been on or played against. No one was a real challenge. They had always been the best without question. But once the international stage presents them with a reason to actually compete against one another, they're both faced with the reality that someone out there in their sport could be better than them. And that makes them intrigued and curious, and they start watching each other's interviews. It also makes Ilia jealous at points, and it also makes them both easy targets for media outlets to exploit them. Hence the rivalry. These guys are generational players that people pay money to go see in person. They are very much the face of marketing for the league. So to have them both end up on rival teams and be drafted number 1 and 2 overall is really a Cinderella story for the sport. We saw it when Ovechkin and Crosby were coming into the league, and so this ignites a fire in both of them that fuels a lot of their interactions, especially in the early days, but it also fuels a larger audience of people to constantly compare them, and that would feed into their need to be the best. It would raise the stakes and also raise the stakes of their hookups and sexual encounters, because over time, it's going to create this deep respect for one another as well, and they can't convince the world outside of, the hotel that they're in to understand that. Nobody but them can understand that. I think for the two of them, it's also fun for them to actually have someone to compare themselves to and compete against, because it would make them both have to work extra hard to beat the other one, and it would make it possible for them to lose, something that they weren't really used to. So it again ignites that competitive nature that they both inherently have, and that deep drive to be the best brings out the best in each other. And that is something that gets mirrored in their relationship dynamic too. In regards to how hockey is a negative thing within their relationship, I think that the culture of the sport is deeply ingrained in both of them, but mostly Shane, and a lot of his fear and the way he thinks and his reactions to situations stem from what the culture expects and celebrates versus shuns and rejects. And Shane understands that very deeply. The thing he wants, which is to be with Ilia, would be shunned and rejected. And so that obstacle, combined with Shane's fear of straying outside the norm and losing control, it causes a lot of problems. And in a relationship like Scott and Kip's, Scott could hide it if he needed to and compartmentalize that part of his life in a way that Shane and Ilia cannot, because they are playing against each other on rival teams, and they're captains of those teams, they're faces of franchises, so they're facing a much higher set of expectations and higher stakes. They also have more eyeballs on them, and their careers would be called into question if they were to be discovered, because it could be insinuated that their relationship affected their play. And the fans of these teams would take that very personally. So the hockey is pivotal, and it plays a very big role in how their relationship starts, how they struggle within it, how they manage expectations throughout it, how they decide as a united front to move forward publicly. And until they retire, hockey will always have a direct impact on their relationship. So it's a very complicated, deep-seated, nuanced thing, hockey culture, and how it affects the parameters around their specific relationship. So I find that fascinating to watch, because a lot of it, again, on screen, for people who don't understand the culture, is not being spelled out very clearly. But as someone who understands it, it feels fairly realistic that their fears would be so high stakes. This question is sort of a follow-up to the previous one, which is, as a hockey person, how much does hockey play into the story? Does it add value? So building on what I said before, hockey isn't just the backdrop of this story, but it's also the environment that Shane and Ilia operate in and exist within. So it's important to think about what that environment actually would do to a person. And also, I think it's important to remember the years in which they are playing the sport, because it's already different now than it was before in some minor ways. And we're looking at this show in a 2025, 2026 mentality. So important to rewind and remember what year it is and how old they are in that phase of their life and all those details. So hockey culture, especially at the elite level, is hyper-masculine. It's very insular and emotionally restrictive in a way that we can see heightens every interaction between Shane and Ilia, because they don't allow themselves to feel their emotions and actively try to repress them. And the sport inherently rewards dominance and control while encouraging players to compartmentalize their emotions and vulnerability and then redirect them into anger or motivation in order to perform better. And that conditioning shapes Shane and Ilia and how they understand themselves, how they communicate, and ultimately how they love. And I think the best way to describe it is that hockey isn't the obstacle they are working around in this show. It's actually what creates the obstacle to begin with. So it doesn't complicate their relationship, it creates the complication. As I mentioned before, hockey becomes your entire world as you move up the ladder within the sport. For players like Shane and Ilia, their childhoods would have been spent in the same rinks, with the same people, under the authority of different coaches, all of whom would influence their worldview just as much as their parents do, especially when they're younger. And that world narrows even further as their careers get bigger. So they would essentially travel from rink to gym, plane to hotel, repeat pre-game rituals, repeat post-game rituals. They'd eat the same meals, recover the same way, day in, day out, for months at a time. And that repetition requires a lot of mental toughness and discipline. But doing the same thing like that for that long reinforces a mindset. And so if the mindset within the sport is that emotions are something to suppress or manage and not something to explore openly because it might make you misstep or underperform, you don't do that. And so that's the pressure cooker environment they're both existing within. Shane and Ilia also enter the league at the same time. They're drafted number 1 and number 2 overall by rival franchises, both with very deep histories, enormous expectations, and like I said earlier, they are uniquely positioned as mirrors of one another. They're the only two people who truly understand the pressure that the other is under, and that's where one of the core themes of the story comes in, which is that they are yin and yang, or two sides of the same coin. That duality shows up not just emotionally, but also in how they play. So Shane is defined by discipline, obsession, preparation. He's a student of hockey in every sense. We see him reading hockey books in his free time. He's meticulous, and he's driven by a desire to be the best. Ilia, in contrast to that, is more of a natural talent. So he loves hockey, but he doesn't live and breathe it in the way that Shane does. He doesn't have to work in the same capacity to be that great. And his relationship to the sport is more shaped by his childhood, because for Ilia, hockey was an escape after his mother died. She had loved watching him play when he was young, but after her death, his grief at 12 years old, pushed him deeper into the game while he sought to get away from his home life and try and grapple with his emotions. And as I touched on before, those different origins create two elite players whose motivations are fundamentally different, but they're also complementary. Also, like I mentioned before, their rivalry only exists and works because neither of them can ever fully outdo the other. For every single stat that favors one of them, you could pull another stat that favors the other one. And that balance between the two sustains the rivalry and keeps them bound to each other at the top of the sport. And they push each other not just because of ego, but because they genuinely enjoy competing against someone who can meet them at their level. And over time, we see that competition evolve into a very deep respect and admiration of one another, even if the league continues to frame it differently. When their feelings enter into the equation, that competitiveness shifts slightly. And as we see over time, their emotions begin to bleed into their play in subtle ways, more like a heightened awareness of each other on the ice. There's flashes of jealousy, but then also deep pride when each of them watches the other win the cup, or in smaller moments when they're more affected by the other one than they want to admit, like at the face-off dot. And there are more fleshed out examples of this in the book than there are in the show, but it is hinted at in a lot of the montages. I talked earlier about how they challenge each other in ways that nobody else can, and this is where that becomes slightly destabilizing, because Shane's earlier jealousy of Ilia when he is young does turn into an attraction and then an admiration. Ilia is both a challenge and a mirror to Shane, because Ilia's existence and Shane's attraction to him force Shane to confront parts of himself that he has buried beneath his achievements and his public persona. One of the most telling changes the show makes underscores this quite well, which is that Shane's injury is rewritten so that it's directly caused by his attention being on Ilia as he carries the puck through the neutral zone, and then he gets hit in an open ice hit, something that is completely against his nature as a player and really against the nature of any hockey player. And as I mentioned before, Shane doesn't make careless mistakes, so that moment makes the subtext explicit, which is that Shane's connection to Ilia is strong enough to override years of his discipline and his instinct. Which brings me back to something I said earlier, which is that hockey isn't the obstacle they're trying to work around. It's what creates the obstacle to begin with. Because they know how the culture feels and they are on the inside of it, they both make educated assumptions as to what the blowback would be if they were to be discovered. They aren't anonymous players. They're rivals, franchise faces, and moneymakers in the league's marketing strategy. And their identities are tied to masculinity, to national and city pride, to the mythology that the league depends upon to draw in its fans. So if the truth came out, it wouldn't just change how fans see them. Their careers would be re-examined, and fans would be likely outraged and feel like they were lied to. And that scrutiny would be compounded by the very real levels of homophobia within the sport from the top down. So the secrecy, the emotional restraint, the refusal to name what they are for years and years, all of those choices mirror what hockey would have drilled into them, which is keep your head down, don't rock the boat. Everything you do is for the better of the team. And that's especially clear in Shane, whose motivations to keep this hidden are, on the one hand, him not fully accepting that he is gay for much of the earlier part of their relationship, but also because he believes that everything should be framed around protecting the team, the league, and the image that he's been taught to uphold. Ilia's fear is more personal. It's tied to his Russian nationality and the risks that come with him potentially being forced out of the sport and having to return to a country that would not be kind to him. And it's also tied to his childhood trauma, and that makes emotional vulnerability feel extremely dangerous to him. Ultimately, as I said before, hockey is not just the backdrop of this story. It's a really big part of their relationship because it dictates the pace of it, given that they only hook up and see each other when they play one another or in the off season. Their love is expressed in large part through their joint competitiveness as professional athletes, and because that personality trait is what allows them to reach the pinnacle of their sport, it makes total sense that it would be a huge element in their relationship dynamic as well. The hockey optics are the reason why there is tension in this story, and it gives the story the high stakes it needs for the audience to feel that yearning and know that their love is not just forbidden, but it's also incompatible with the very culture and system that made them who they are and that they live and breathe within every single day. And that's a broader theme that a lot of people can closely identify with. This question is, I'm curious your thoughts on Ilia's hesitance to fully grab Shane when he's kissing and why that is. I feel like there are so many moments like the All-Star Night 1, kissing up the stairway in episode 4, and even their deep first kiss at the cottage in episode 6, where I think Ilia is hesitant to fully embrace Shane because he doesn't think Shane is fully his. But I don't know because he does it in almost every episode. So curious to know if you think it's something. So I think this is largely a Connor Story physicality thing and probably not an entirely conscious decision by the intimacy coordinator and the director, but I could also be very wrong. I do think that there is some serious merit in the notion that Ilia does not fully hold on to Shane until he is his to hold, but he also grabs Shane's face a lot to tilt his head up or to force eye contact or to kiss him. And he does that quite often and has no hesitations in taking that liberty and grabbing him there. We also do see Ilia fully embrace Shane in episode 5 in the All-Star Hotel scene. So he is capable, but you're correct that throughout the series, Ilia does keep a looser grip on Shane at times, and he does that consistently. So it's a mannerism that they maintained with continuity over the course of multiple years. Whether it's Connor himself who created that mannerism for Ilia and kept it consistent across the storyline, or something they worked on with Jacob and the intimacy coordinator, I'm not sure, but it was something I noticed too. So I think there has to be a reason behind it, and your reasoning is actually a beautiful metaphor as to why that would be applicable. This question is, my friends and I were discussing the food relationship the characters have in the show/book. For example, they're hockey players. Could they not really down 8 burgers? Also, I think macrobiotics allows Shane to eat meat. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts if you have an upcoming video or an opinion about it. So I'm taking this question, kind of running with it, and to talk about the food relationship, specifically Shane's. And this is a topic that, of course, is very nuanced. It has multiple angles that you can look at it from. And this is just my observation and my interpretation of some of these topics that are mentioned a lot in The Long Game. So, first question, which is, could they have eaten the 8 burgers? Yes, absolutely. They could have easily eaten 8 burgers. But I think that the relationships with food for Shane and Ilia are very much narrative devices to kind of further convey their personalities. So Ilia eats what he wants. He eats quickly. He eats slightly messy, and he doesn't restrict himself. Whereas Shane eats very specific foods aimed for performance and longevity. He eats very neatly. He often covers his mouth, and he further expands upon his dieting in The Long Game. He also has comfort drinks like ginger ale. I think it's important to keep in mind as well that they are professional athletes on teams with trainers and nutritionists and people whose entire job it is to make sure they are performing at their best every day. So those types of conversations are happening daily within their teams. It is very easy for them to access nutritionists. They have team chefs. They have their meals at the rink and on the road provided for them a vast majority of the time. And for Shane, who loves control in all areas of his life because it makes him feel safe, food is naturally an area where he would want to exhibit that control. And it makes total sense then that when other areas of his life feel like they are spiraling out of control, he would tighten his grip on the easiest thing he can control, which is food. For Ilia, I think that the act of eating has never been something communal for him, where we see Shane often eating with other people like Hayden and his family, or his parents, or Rose. The only time we see him eating on screen with his family is during the funeral scene, and he is very uptight and uncomfortable, which is in direct contrast to when he eats with Shane. When he shares the tuna melt with Shane in episode 4. He eats the burgers with Shane at the cottage in the finale, and then he has dinner with Shane's parents. So I don't think the ritual of it has ever had any real significance to him until he has a partner and a family to eat with. I also think that Ilia can tell that Shane's focus on food is always coming from there being an imbalance in another area of his life. So Ilia would want Shane to work through those issues and regulate himself rather than restrict himself in the way that he is. So he encourages that in the long game, but as his own depression worsens, he often uses the food conversation as a way to pick a fight or express his frustration with Shane about other things, because it's the easiest thing to poke at and get a reaction out of Shane with. And we see that in the Christmas scene in the long game specifically. The macrobiotic diet is interesting because this is a show-only addition to the story, and macrobiotic diets are largely based on Zen Buddhist principles. And I've already pointed out, and I think other people probably at this point have too, pointed out the concept of Shane and Ilia being like a yin and yang in the show. And so their food habits are just another layer to that. They have black and white outfits on in the beginning of the series in episode 1 with the water bottle scene. I noticed very early on that their stick tape is black and white. So on the face-offs, we can see the yin and yang. So this fits very neatly into the story and is another way that they're represented as opposite but independent forces that create a greater whole once they're in harmony with one another, which is very much what yin and yang is about. Shane also tells Rose in the long game that he thinks he might be drawn to exhibiting discipline and how it makes him feel better mentally, more so than eating food that makes him feel better physically. And he says, I like to practice discipline and self-control and be rewarded for it. That's all. To me, that can be broken down even further given Shane's personality, and it can be interpreted as him needing routines and structure to feel safe and regulated, which is something we already know he needs. And he functions best when he has consistency and structure. So the reward aspect is more of a way to have measurable data and progress, but also praise when it comes to Shane and Ilia's sexual relationship. But as far as food is concerned, he's trying to use food to improve his performance on the ice. And in the long game, he's getting older. He's entering into the age bracket where players start to feel their age in hockey. And he wants to play for a long time and is trying to control how long his career will be in any way he can. Because if a person's career is unpredictable by nature, Shane wants to control as much of it as he can. And his body and his training and his diet are all controllable factors. After Shane and Ilia are discovered, Shane actually spirals and tells Ilia he ate a Snickers bar. And Ilia FaceTimes him right away because he knows that something is deeply wrong for Shane to do that and also to admit it to Ilia. For Shane, the candy bar would be like triage because he's so dysregulated and he needs to reach for something that he has coded as bad because he feels bad. And this scene also reinforces that Shane is not someone who typically deviates from a plan. He is dealing with extreme internal pressure, and that distress is what makes him lose control. And we know that losing control is his deepest fear. Ilia tells him in that scene that he can eat whatever he wants because it's his life and it's not the league's or his team's. So it clues the reader and the viewer into Shane's motivations for the dieting being largely set around his career first. But by the end of the book, Shane says he's done fighting the future and trying to be perfect. He'd been an incredible hockey player his whole life while occasionally eating a cheeseburger, and he could continue to do that. So again, once his personal life falls into a place where he feels he has relative control and happiness within it, he loosens up on the dieting. So it'll be interesting to see if Jacob Tierney leans into that. And if he does lean into that, how he approaches that narrative, because it's definitely a sensitive topic and one that I have no doubt he will handle with care if he chooses to cover it. This question is, I'm not sure if you've talked about the differences between Svetlana in the book versus the show, but I'd love to hear your insights into the importance of Ilia having her in his life. So I think I've touched on this in other videos, maybe little snippets here and there, but I think the changes to her character are wonderful and make a lot of sense, because she is a window into Ilia in many scenes in season 1 and can continue to be that in season 2. And making her a childhood friend made it possible for us to see how Ilia behaves with people that he trusts and loves, which we can then contrast with the behavior he exhibits with Shane and easily mark that behavior as him masking and then slowly he begins to act more so like he does with Svetlana once Shane makes him feel safe enough to do so. Her being his closest friend and confidant also makes Svetlana a big part in Ilia confronting his own feelings about Shane ahead of the Russian monologue scene. And narratively, it mirrors how Rose is used in the plot and kind of rounds out that female character arc that all of these women have in aiding their men so beautifully. But the addition of the funeral scene in particular, where her role within it gives us so much great context, is really, I think, pivotal in understanding what her real purpose is in the show version. And it comes ahead of Ilia's phone call with Shane, and we don't get that context in the book. And knowing that she was so pivotal in him having the bravery to call Shane and then incite him feeling brave enough to admit that he's in love with him, even though it's in Russian, it's nice to know that in the show version, Svetlana is directly linked to that behavior. Svetlana also knows Ilia so well that she can often voice things that we as viewers are observing, like her pointing out how bad Ilia is at hiding his messages with Jane. I also think for season 2, now that we know just how close Svetlana and Ilia are, and that they love one another so deeply and care for each other as friends, it will make Ilia's depression storyline and the way he pulls away from everyone in his life that much more powerful, because she is another person that we can see it affect directly, other than just Shane. If he is pulling away from the person closest to him outside of Shane, then it makes the severity of his depression exceedingly clear without exposition. Then there's the added layer of Svetlana knowing him since he was a child, which implies that she would have known him before his mother died, theoretically, and would have likely known his mother. And so I think that that's really important, as he, again, in season 2 is going to be dealing with a lot of memories of his mom and trauma about her passing, that if they include more scenes where Svetlana is included in the storyline, even if he's talking to his therapist and he mentions that she was around when he was a kid, it just paints a much more vivid picture of Ilia, and she's used as a narrative device to convey more about him and more about that time in his life. And her being able to love him in the way that she has as a friend is really beautiful, because Ilia's character has always resolved himself as being unlovable or difficult to love or not worthy of love. And so placing someone like her in his life is a really nice thing for the character himself. And I think that it would be really rewarding if we have scenes where she gets to meet Shane earlier on, because in the book she only meets him right before they get married, and it's been years, and she doesn't know about their relationship until Ilia tells her, and he's been in Ottawa for a couple of years at that point. So hopefully they kind of rearrange that. I think they owe it to the character now, since they made so many changes to her in season 1, that they give her a lot more material in season 2 and utilize her in really smart ways that I think Jacob has already kind of teed up really beautifully. This question is, what do you think about the addition of Ilia having a niece that is not in the book? I personally think this is a great way to still keep Ilia connected to Russia, and also the show can use her and Svetlana, since the show version of her is still tied to Russia since her father is there, to give us glimpses into that culture and to better inform Ilia's behavior and how he conducts himself by adding that context. And I think the show, including the line about him creating a trust for her that she can access at 18, is also a way to show the viewer the type of person Ilia is and how he is good and kind and can see beyond the hatred of his brother to still have love for his family in his heart. And they can also use the niece as a way to keep Alexei in the storyline, since we don't see him in the long game. It could play into memories or something that Ilia experiences while in therapy, or maybe therapy helps him to reconnect with him or make peace with him more formally. So I do think that it's a way to kind of round out his life a little bit more, make his storyline a little richer in some small way. I think having her be there and then him creating a trust despite his relationship with Alexei is, again, a way to reinforce how good and kind Ilia's heart is, and that he is so self-sacrificing and he will do the right thing by people, especially people who are related to him, and his niece wouldn't have done anything wrong. So him taking care of her in that way, again, is a really great way to reinforce who he is as a person without it being spelled out so literally. So I like that change. I think that they could do a lot with it, or they could do nothing at all with it, and it really was impactful to have her there in season 1. I liked this question, and it was, why doesn't Shane ever wear his Reeboks? So this is a great way for us to see how Shane's persona is unaligned with who Shane is as a person. And this is all added for the show, and it's a really ingenious narrative device that they use to make that point very clear. In the book, we are in Shane's head and know how he feels, so we can sort of understand how he is internally very different than the way he is marketed externally within the hockey world. But the show needed a way to take that information and his thoughts and feelings and make it visually apparent for the viewer. And so this is a really great way to do that, all of the commercials. And same with him always drinking ginger ale as his comfort drink, but then doing a commercial with an orange soda brand, or being a Rolex ambassador when his clothing styles and choices of clothing are mainly t-shirts and athletic clothes. So him not wearing them, I think, is less so about him rejecting the brand deal, more so about when it's up to him and it's his choice, those are not the shoes he's reaching for. And it's just another brand partnership and commercial and long-term deal that he has that is assigned to Shane, the hockey player, and the public persona, rather than something that Shane, the person, feels aligned with. And I really think that's brilliant. Question is, with every choice in the show being so intentional, what did you think of them using classical pieces a handful of times, and especially the use of Moonlight Sonata for the monologue scene? Great question. I really loved this one. So yes, there's a few times where they use classical pieces of music. Mozart is playing during the first commercial scene that Shane and Ilia shoot in Toronto in episode 1. Then the first time we hear the Russian composer is in episode 2 when Ilia is in the bedroom with his father. And that song fades over the scene of Svetlana saving Ilia while he's dissociating and walking him to the bathroom where Sasha is at. So that is by a Russian composer. Then there's another one during the figure skating scene at the Olympics. There are 2 songs while Ilia is at home, one while he's standing in front of the window, and then another during the funeral scene. Then we get Moonlight Sonata during the Russian monologue scene. And then we also have classical music playing when Shane is at his parents' cottage recovering from his injuries and texting Ilia from the sofa. That's a Bach song playing in the background of the house. The song playing during the commercial is Mozart's 29th Symphony. This is a symphony that Mozart wrote when he was 18, which I think is kind of interesting when you consider how young Shane and Ilia are in that scene. So that's kind of a fun tie, if you will. The scene when Svetlana comes and saves Ilia and brings him into the bathroom, that's by the composer Rachmaninoff, and it's his second piano concerto. I loved how the use of that concerto, it fades and gets quieter as Ilia's dissociation starts to strengthen, and then it increases the volume as they're walking to the bathroom, and then the tone of it changes throughout the conversation in the bathroom as well. So it's used really beautifully in those scenes. The song that plays when Shane's figure skating friend is competing in the Olympics is called The Great Gate of Kiev, and it's a very grand song. It's the finale of the piano suite of Pictures at an Exhibition. So a very big song meant for a big moment in the Olympics. For the scenes in Russia around Ilia's father's death, there's an interesting tie to the actual songs itself if you dig deeper. I did talk about the song playing when Ilia is standing in front of the window in one of my breakdown videos, and the song playing during the funeral is a song that's tied to fallen World War II soldiers, and that's interesting when you consider that his father has all these medals and he was decorated, and so they kind of link the music to that visual in that scene, which I thought was really brilliant. The song itself is called, or it's translated into, The Cranes, and it's talking about fallen soldiers who are being compared to white cranes flying in the sky, and it's meant to be a metaphor for their souls, leaving the battlefield. The Moonlight Sonata use is really kind of cool because it's long been believed that Mozart wrote it for an unrequited love or someone who he was deeply in love with but couldn't be with. It's also used really beautifully here because in the book, Shane describes the feeling of Ilia's voice washing over him, and it very much feels like it's musical in a sense. And so I think that them putting this piano over it and then using the audio in such a clever way where at the beginning of the monologue, Ilia's voice is coming through a telephone, and then at a certain point in the monologue, his voice is right there with Shane. It's like he's sitting right next to him, talking to him. There's no more phone line static coming through, and his voice is clear as day alongside with this music. So it's a really great way of conveying that sentiment from the book. In the book, Shane also describes it as very intimate, like they were somehow sharing a bigger secret now than when they slept together. And so the song kind of adds to that level of intimacy as well. During the scene where Shane and Ilia are texting late at night in episode 5, the song Prelude and Fugue number 1 by Bach is playing in the background. So it's implied that in their house growing up, maybe Yuna would play classical music at night, which I think is a beautiful detail. Although I have seen discourse online that it might be a different title of Bach's, a different song of Bach's. So clearly a lot of thought went into the choices and selections of these songs and how they were going to be used in the show. And I think the sound mixing of the show is really incredible, but the people who are picking the songs for the soundtrack did such a masterful job of layering in original score, these classical moments, and then obviously the soundtrack that we all know and love from the montage moments and playing in the background in restaurants, and they layer in the music in this show so beautifully. So I really, really commend them for how well they've done and how intentional it was done. So I got multiple versions of this next question, which is, why do I think this show changed so many of us and completely took over our lives in such a short time frame? And also how I think the timing of it might have impacted that. And I actually was interviewed this very question, so I had written down my thoughts on it. And there are many, but again, this is kind of coming from my personal angle. So I think this story resonated across genders and sexual orientations and generations. And obviously it's about love and it's a love story. It's also a queer story, but at its core, it's also about pressure and pressure to conform, to perform, and to present yourself in a very specific way. And as an athlete myself and someone who played hockey, that really stood out to me. There's a lot to unpack in terms of how you're expected to show up in the spaces within the hockey world and what strength looks like, what emotions are allowed and what aren't. But even if you've never played hockey or even a team sport in general, I think everyone understands on some level the pressure that comes with wanting to be seen, understood, and loved for who you actually are, and not a version of yourself you create in order to conform. And what the show does so effectively is place those universal themes inside of this hyper-masculine world of professional hockey that we don't often see depicted with this level of vulnerability. So that contrast is very powerful. Watching characters struggle with identity and emotional expression, all while trying to belong in an environment that traditionally discourages those things, makes this story feel incredibly human. So while I think it resonates with men who recognize that culture firsthand, it also speaks to anyone who has felt constrained by the expectation society places on them, and that is a universal experience. In that way, the show becomes a lens for examining how idealized masculinity shapes behavior, not just in sports. And it captures what it feels like to be on the outside looking in with a lot of empathy. It's also connecting a lot of people who appreciate well-developed, complex characters, and it's incited a lot of discussion about writing and storytelling. And on my personal pages, breaking down scenes in a way that highlights the craft has been really enjoyable, and it's been helping me with the construction of my own characters while writing my first novel with my co-author. But on the artistic side, as someone who loves book-to-screen adaptations and filmmaking as a craft, I was really struck by how intentionally this show was made. The attention to detail is incredible. There are visual and narrative callbacks throughout the series that reward close viewing, and you're meant to notice the nuance in the physicality, in the framing, and a lot of what makes this show so gripping is what's being said without dialogue. That feels especially meaningful in the context of the current streaming era, where so many shows assume the audience is half watching and the characters are often repeating plot points out loud because viewers are scrolling on their phones. And this show does the opposite. It asks you to lean in, and that kind of storytelling encourages conversation and rewatches and excitement, where on a third or fourth viewing, you might catch a detail that was hidden in plain sight, and then it helps to deepen the emotional impact of what you've just watched. And I also think that the slow drip weekly episode drops added to that community building as well. So you can really tell how much the entire production team cared about the story that they were telling, because it shows up everywhere. It shows up in the set design, especially given their budget constraints. It shows up in the lighting, which to me, it functions as its own character. It shows up in the costuming, which very subtly tracks emotional shifts and power dynamics, and also the timeline of the story, and it's reflectant of the year that the scene is taking place in. You can see that in the sound design. Little things like how you can hear the hum of traffic outside whenever Shane and Ilia are in a hotel room, or you can very audibly hear the sound of fabric brushing against the couch during an intimate scene, so it feels like we're very much encroaching on that moment. All of those things create an intimacy that pulls the viewer further into the world that Jacob Tierney created. And even structurally, moments like the extended one shot in the finale adds to that intimacy in a way that feels very deliberate and earned. And there are visual echoes all over the place through small movements and physicality, words and phrases that reappear later and feel familiar without ever being spelled out for you. The show trusts its audience to be intelligent and emotionally perceptive, and that trust is incredibly refreshing. So I think that the combination of the very human themes presented with empathy and optimism by the end of the story, and also that it was executed with such intentional artistry, that to me is why the show has stayed with people, because it didn't just tell a story to you, it made us all participants in that emotional investment, and it makes us feel like we all went on that journey together. Or as Shane would say, together. This question says, I'd love to hear more about your background and how it relates to the insights you share, for example, attachment styles. So I inherited my cinephilia from my mother and grew up watching movies and TV with her daily. She worked in continuity when she was younger, and so every time we watched any form of storytelling, she would point out continuity errors and explain the magic behind the scenes and how shots were composed and shown on screen. And that constant exposure to storytelling and the craft that goes into visual storytelling was a huge part of my upbringing and definitely shaped my interest in it. I was also a visual art and art history major in college, so studying art in all of its many forms is another facet of my approach to these videos. In regards to the attachment style insights, that's largely from my own work with a coach and learning about my own attachment style, and doing a lot of that hard work to understand it and wrap my brain around it in myself and also in people around me so that I can better navigate interpersonal relationships. And I would also say that I've always been very emotionally intuitive and observant. I think that's something I've always been. So all of those things pour into how I consume media and watch TV and movies, and I think that understanding the humanness of characters is something I've always really been interested in doing. And as I'm writing my own novel with my co-author, I'm fascinated by character development and shaping characters, so it's always been an interest of mine, and this show is a really great example of very well written characters, so it's easy for me to deep dive into it. This question is, I want to know your process for creating these breakdowns of the show and books. How much homework do you do in order to create these? Do you collaborate with other content creators or just other people to help you make these videos, or are they entirely of your own creation? First of all, thank you for asking. I spend quite a bit of time reviewing the show and the book before finalizing any of my breakdown scripts, and a lot of the more thematic videos and topics are born out of conversations with my friend and creative partner, Lo, and her and I are co-writing a novel series right now, so we're always nerding out on story structure and character development, and it's always a continuous discussion that organically produces content. And as we watched Heated Rivalry, that was very much the case. We were having these long discussions, and probably the 100th time we started having one of these, Lo told me to record my thoughts, and I finally listened. So hopefully she'll agree to record her thoughts on this podcast with me sometime soon, so you can all hear how our conversations tend to flow upstream, and then we suddenly arrive at a creative watering hole that solves 5 problems we didn't even know we had. On the whole, though, when I'm breaking down each individual scene, a lot of my commentary is just things I'm observing as I'm watching. Usually when I'm consuming media, I will watch it the first time just to enjoy it, and then the second time I will watch it and pay attention to the details of the scene. So some of them I notice right away, even when I'm viewing it for the first time and trying to just enjoy the media. I will notice visual cues, I will notice repeated patterns, I will notice blocking, lighting, sound mixing. I will notice those things just because I always look for them in media, and as I'm consuming the media, the things I'm pointing out to myself, I often think might be interesting for other people to have pointed out for them. So the second time I watch something through, I'll make note of all of those little details. And then when I'm writing the scripts, I just make sure that the angle that I'm thinking the scene might want to be conveyed in, or the context I'm thinking might be applicable there, I just fact check it with the book or the source material, and then run it through my own brain to figure out how to best convey what I'm trying to say in a clear and concise way for people, and one that easily ties it back to the book if that's what I'm doing in the review, or connects it to, in some cases we're talking about attachment styles, or just my insights and understanding of the character and how I'm interpreting the scene versus how I think strategically the scene is being shot or edited, and how that would inform the way it's meant to be interpreted. So there's a lot of homework that goes into these breakdowns, and I definitely try and do all of it before I publish anything to make sure that my point of view is coming from a place that's a well-rounded and educated one. All right, I think I'm going to wrap this up there. Puts us right around the 1 hour mark, which is great. I pretty much covered all of the heavy-hitting questions, but I did still have a number of questions that people had submitted, which I'm so appreciative of. If it's of interest, I'm sure we could put together a part 3 of this Q&A. And if you have any additional questions, as always, be sure to leave them on any of my socials, and I will do my best to get back to you individually, or like I said, put it into another episode like this if people are liking the more long form answers. So thank you again so much for tuning in, for listening. This has been a long episode, so if you've made it to the end, I really, really appreciate it, and I will see you all in the next one.